Hello and welcome to episode 11 of Forensic Fix, a podcast brought to you from MSAB, where we invite guests from the industry to discuss the latest news in digital forensics, cyber safety, current issues, and a general chat about all things cyber. So I am your host, Adam Furman, a tech evangelist here at MSAB. So I am absolutely delighted to announce that we have Jen Hoey joining us on episode 11 of Forensic Fix, all the way from New South Wales in Australia. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting Jen at a conference on the Gold Coast way back in April of this year, and her story was one that really resonated with me. So I'm delighted that she has agreed to join me on the show today for what will be a slightly different topic, but one that I'm extremely passionate about, ensuring that we can educate as many carers, parents as we can around this global issue. Now, Jen is a parent cyber safety consultant, and she's the founder of Not My Kid. Her mission is to preserve childhood and keep children safe from online child exploitation by empowering parents and carers through education. So Jen is a mum of three, and unfortunately, she has experienced firsthand the dangers that the online world poses to children. Now, one of the most challenging negative experiences was when her 9-year-old daughter got caught up with an online predator through a game. Living through that gave us some serious insight into the tough things kids and parents are navigating in this digital age. The experience has led her to start Not My Kid and to work as a cyber safety consultant with parents who want to learn how to keep their children safe online. She has completed numerous courses to back up her expertise, and she's currently on the road to a degree in criminology and criminal justice. Now, Jen, welcome to the show, and I've given our listeners a small insight into the history of your journey and why you're so passionate about cyber safety for parents. But for those of you who are not aware of you and the work that you've done in this space, can you give us some more detail about your past, your career path, and if you can share your details of your experiences with parents and cyber safety?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, Adam. I had no experience in this field before my daughter made her disclosure. Before that, I was working for a multinational company in Switzerland, emigrated to Australia, and work currently as a practice manager managing my husband's psychiatric practice. In 2016, my daughter disclosed to me that she had an incident, or a few encounters actually, with an online predator when she was 9. At the time, what we saw was a child who was outgoing, had lots of friends, loved dancing, literally overnight gave up everything she enjoyed. She started struggling to sleep at night. She started eating a lot less. She became listless. But the most noticeable thing was her separation anxiety from me. She was subsequently diagnosed with clinical depression. She was medicated at the age of 9 for a brief period. And it was at the beginning of her last year of primary school when the school sent out a note asking parents for permission for their children to participate in a sex education class. Now, she was adamant that she didn't want to do this class, which I thought was a little strange because we'd had reasonably open conversations in our home. And then one evening she called me into her bedroom and she said, "Mummy, I've done something terrible." At that moment, I just asked her if she could tell me anything more, but she scribbled 2 words on a piece of paper, and those words were sex and game. Now, as a parent, my heart sank. I had a suspicion that she may be telling me what I thought she may be telling me, but I wasn't sure. So what I did is I basically internalized my own feelings of distress, and I comforted her. I knew and I could see how hard this disclosure had been for her. And so what I did is I sat down, I wrapped my arms around her, and I said, "Can you tell me anything more?" So she said to me she'd been on a game, and she said, "I did the one thing you've told me never to do. I went on the chat, and I started chatting to another 9-year-old little girl. And this little girl persuaded me to perform sex acts within the game. And then after a while, she said, and the one thing that really disturbed me is that I kept going back to the chat. And eventually this little girl told me that if I told anyone, the police would arrest me and her. And so for 2 years, I've been afraid that the police would come at any minute and take me away from you. So that was pretty big. Pretty big disclosure. She wasn't at that moment, she didn't allow me to convince her that it was in fact an adult. And so I could see I couldn't get through to her that night. So I just comforted her and sat with her until she fell asleep. I got no sleep. We'd had rules in place in our home. We had one big iMac in the kitchen. There were parental controls on it. No one could play multiplayer games. People had to ask for permission to download games.
Yeah.
And I had no idea where this had happened. So I decided to call the police, the local police station, the next day. And I was really calling them to find out if they had somewhere on a website a list of games that predators were known to frequent. And the police officer was very kind, and he just said, they're on all the games. And then he asked me why I was calling, and I explained the situation to him. And he did something which I think he stepped out of what he needed to do. He said, please give your daughter a message. This was definitely a predator. They always threaten children. Please tell her she's safe. Yeah. And so I was able to pass that message on to my daughter. And I think that was the beginning of her journey to recovery. But it was my journey. It was the beginning of my journey to understand this crime type in detail. And I sat up late at night, sometimes at 2 a.m. attending webinars. I literally threw myself into understanding everything I possibly could about this crime type. It just kind of created this passion in me that I really, really didn't want anyone else to have this happen to their child. Yeah. So when my little boy, started primary school in 2019, I was really worried when I saw the number of children who were 6 years old, who were allowed online gaming, to use the internet with very, very little supervision. And instead of being that parent, lecturing other parents in the playground, I decided to start Not My Kid. And that's when it began. And since then, I have been able to reach a reasonable number of parents. But it still is an issue that parents struggle to want to understand. And that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. And that must have been incredibly difficult, because as a parent myself, and I'm sure other parents can resonate, the anger that you must have felt when that disclosure took place, but you totally did the right thing in how you reacted. But a lot of parents would just be angry and instantly want to catch that predator. How did you find it in yourself to sort of take that approach?
Well, I mean, first of all, I could see how hard it had been for her. Secondly, I knew she hadn't been on the game for 2 years. There was no way I was going to find the predator. And I think just instinctively, I just knew that if I'd got angry, if I'd started crying, she would have shut down completely. So I just knew that what she needed was my complete and utter support. And I told her, I said, I believe you, I love you, and I will help you through this. Because at that time, she made me swear not to tell anyone else what had happened. And it was a few years later, after I founded Not My Kid, that I actually found the courage to write the story. And I went to her and I said, I've written the story. And she just said, I don't want to read it. And I said, that's okay. It's here when you're ready. And a few weeks later, she came and said, can I read it? And then she asked me if she could share it with a friend. So I think what putting the story on paper did for her and for me was that it allowed her to see the little girl that she was, and basically see herself as a survivor rather than a victim. And a year later, when she was 16, she gave me permission to go public with her story, which I think was an incredibly brave move. So, in many ways, I'm a messenger. It's her bravery that's brought me to where I am today.
No, that's amazing. And sort of the people who work in sort of the industries that I deal with, that they deal with prevention. That there is a lot of prevention technology, but sometimes a lot of it is reactive and sort of after the event's taken place. So I'm sure this story is going to help resonate why they're doing the work they're doing. But would you be able to disclose what the game was?
Yes. What was the game? It was Fresh Hotel.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's exactly like the police officer advised you at the time. As a previous police officer myself, I was aware that, and he was correct, is that these predators are everywhere. It's unfortunate, and I think that's one of the scars that I bear from being a police officer, is that I'm very, very cynical.
Yeah.
And my poor son is going to have to deal with this, that I do not trust online platforms. And I've seen it from Roblox, from Minecraft, all of the platforms where you think that they're big companies, but it happens, and these people are amongst us. And I remember when I first got into this space, and it's a horrible way of saying about predators, but I got told they're like rats. You are always close to them without realizing.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I'm just as strict with my 10-year-old. But I think one of the things that I've done is I've educated him. So it's not just me saying no. I've explained to him precisely what happened to his sister. I've talked about predators. I've even downloaded an app to change my own face to looking, 20 years younger, just to show him visually what they can and are capable of doing. So because I think these conversations have to be ongoing. We need to repeat the conversations continuously. So
yeah.
What were you going to say?
Unfortunately for children I was going to say, unfortunately for children in sort of my family space, that they had me dealing with sort of the end part of it. And my mum worked in probation here in the UK, which is sort of dealing with offenders after the events. And the majority of the people she dealt with were sex offenders. So me and my mum sort of, between us, educate any family member that these people are normal people. You wouldn't suspect it. And and I think you're right in what you say, that it's an education. It's about being open, honest with children. If you're prepared to give them access to an online environment, then you need to be honest.
Absolutely.
And explain the dangers, which is no different to us in a real world saying, do not go and talk to strangers.
That's exactly right. And I mean, and it's parents have this false sense of security that if their child is in their bedroom on their device, that they're safe. But in fact, it's the complete opposite. And that's why one of the things I say to parents is you've got to keep all devices out of private spaces, because the majority of the time, that's when things go wrong.
Totally.
And my son has been exposed already. He's already had...
Really?
Yeah, he's already had children at school show him horror, where he couldn't sleep for 2 months. And he's also had... In fact, I'm so fortunate that I've had the conversations, because he was able to come and tell me after school one day that there were children who were Googling, he said, private pictures. So, I was then able to address that with the principal, and she took over. But, if I hadn't had those conversations, he probably would have just sat and watched what they were doing.
Yeah. And this may shock you. I was talking to a colleague who used to work in the counter-terrorism space. Sort of advised him that this podcast was coming up. And he said, that's really interesting. He said, because when he worked in counter-terrorism, he wasn't even aware that children are groomed in online games for terrorism. So he was explaining how part of his role was monitoring games such as Call of Duty, which a lot of parents will let their teenagers play, even though it is an 18-rated game. But in those games, they're becoming desensitized to murder, to blood, and people were being groomed to go and join right-wing sort of Islamic parties. And that really shocks me, because I'd only been sort of involved in the child sexual exploitation sort of space, but it even reaches counter-terrorism.
Yep, I've read that as well. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I have children in my son's class. Now, my son is 10, who are on Call of Duty.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And that's, like we said, it's an 18-rated game, so that's been enabled by parents.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So with the work you're doing, Jen, what does a day-to-day look for you I suppose it's always different, but can you give our listeners sort of an insight into what a day-to-day is like for you?
Well, it's probably not that exciting, really, because, if to be honest, I don't get as many parent consultations as I would like, because I think parents on the whole don't really, they don't want to engage with this issue. So pretty much my morning is often devoted to reading papers. I'm studying, of course. I'm also devoted that to studying. Trying to formulate social media posts. And then, the afternoon I go into my husband's psychiatric practice. And that's another story, because we're seeing the fallout of problematic internet use in the practice big time.
Yeah.
And we have, and then that's really worrying. We're getting more and more referrals for teenagers. And these are children who are presenting with serious mental health issues. I mean, suicidal ideation. Some have attempted suicide, self-harm. I mean, these are very serious issues. And that does concern me.
Yeah. And the online world is amazing. It's enabling me in the UK to chat to you in Australia.
Yeah.
So it has its advantages, but I'm also seeing it in children nowadays that their sort of social skills are not as good.
That's right.
Because they're sat looking at a screen like a zombie.
Yes.
And it's really hard. And I don't think COVID assisted with that at all. In the UK, it was really bad and people were locked away for months. And there's kids who are coming out of that with social anxiety, not interacting. But I don't think the online world is helping with that.
No. And I mean, during COVID, I refused to do any online schoolwork with my son. I mean, we read, we did mathematics in a book, but I just decided I wasn't going to go down that road. My daughter did dance classes with him, and in the spare room, and we managed to get through. But it was hard. It was challenging, and I do agree with you. COVID has tipped things a bit over the edge, I think.
Yeah. So, with your vast knowledge in this space now and your experience, what would you say are the biggest challenges that parents face with keeping their children safe online?
I think the biggest challenges at the moment definitely is the potential for online grooming and sextortion, which we're seeing a substantial increase in the cases in Australia, and also access to online pornography. That's a real problem, and it's a real concern. I mean, I've had children in my son's year mimicking porn in the school playground. So I think that for parents, the challenge is finding a balance. And I think that balance means that devices really need to be used in public spaces where they can actually see what their children are doing. I don't think they should ever be used in private spaces.
Because it's hard, isn't it? Sometimes the children are more technical and savvy than the parents. For example, and I think I've spoken about this before on this podcast, and I don't think my brother listens, but I went to a soccer game with So just to repeat it for those who haven't listened, so I went to a soccer game with my nephew, who advised me how he was playing his PlayStation without my brother knowing. And basically, he moved it to his iPad and just took his controller upstairs. So there's even my brother, who's fairly technical, but my nephew at 14 knew more than him.
Yeah, and that's a real problem, and that's happening more and more and more. I mean, my son of 10, I don't know how he knows this, but he sat and proceeded to tell me there's an app called Life 360, and our whole family is on the app so that we can see where we each are. And he proceeded to tell me how he knows how to make it show that you're in one location when you're in actual fact in another location. I actually think he was making it up, because I said to him, how do you know that? But, he's pushing the boundaries already just by having those conversations with me. I think he's testing me a bit, but
But no, it is a scary space. And you're right, especially with pornography sites, like the leading ones, they're now being forced to say, are you over 18? Well, that's not really enough, is it?
No.
Because people are just going to click, yes, I am.
Absolutely. Exactly. Thank God Omegle has shut down, because
Yeah.
that was a big problem. I went on it myself. It was a little bit hair raising, but
Yeah, I did as well. Yeah.
but yeah, and I'm disappointed that that the Australian government has not voted for age verification yet, because I think that would be a deterrent in some way. But we have to. I think for parents, one of the other things that I try to tell parents is the importance of educating your children with protective behavior. In other words, teaching your child the correct names for their body parts. What is the difference between a safe and an unsafe secret? Safe secret has an end.
Yeah.
Early warning signs. Where do their children feel it when they're nervous in their body? And they should come and tell a safe adult. And choosing a safety team. I do this at the beginning of every school year with my son. We nominate 5 people who he feels comfortable approaching. And I say, right, I'm going to let them know who they are. And this is your safety team. So I think that's really important, because that's the groundwork, so that if they do have an encounter that they don't feel okay about, and they feel those feelings in their stomach, or wherever, they can approach a safe adult and say, hey, because I've said to him, it's not your job to keep yourself safe. It's my job to keep you safe. And there's nothing you can tell me that will shock me. Nothing.
Yeah.
But I think it's the importance of having regular conversations.
Yeah. And being open with your children. My wife and I are doing this with our son at the moment, sort of explaining about safe people, safe spaces and all that. And it is about that openness and sort of just, yes, like our child, for example, is 6. Yes, he's young, but he's still old enough to understand those conversations about what's right and what's wrong, and
Absolutely.
what his body parts are. And
I mean, I told my son exactly what sex was when he was 5. Now, some parents are like, whoa, that's a bit young. But I knew that by the time he was 8, I had to introduce the porn conversation, which I've done.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be anything graphic. You just have to say, it's private pictures that are on the computer. But it's interesting, because the other day I was having a conversation with him about sextortion, and he looked at me, and this is why I think it's so important that we remember that children developmentally change, and that we have to have these conversations all the time. Because he looked at me and he said to me, but how do these people find a photo of a naked lady to send a boy? And I said, I'm like, hello, how many conversations have we had about, private photos online? But for, he just, that hadn't entered his head for some reason, that he was like, even on Google. And I was like, yes. So that's why why I look after you and protect you and keep you safe. But it was just interesting that after all the conversations I've had, he still had that question.
Yeah.
So we had to have, we just have to revisit those conversations on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. And maybe it's a boy thing, but I find I constantly have to repeat myself to my son, because he'll take it in for a few days and then
exactly. And that's what children do. I mean, I think that's, when I comforted my daughter that night, I said to her, she said to me, why are you not angry? And I said, well, because you were just a curious little girl. That's what children are supposed to be. But unfortunately, someone was waiting.
And that's the hard part, isn't it? About finding that balance of letting children be children, but also keeping them safe.
That's right. But, we have playgrounds that are, scrutinized for safety. And I think there needs to be way more done when it comes to the online space.
Yeah. And we're recording this before Christmas, and the episode's going to come out just before Christmas. And unfortunately, I think some will be under the tree already. But what advice would you offer to parents and carers who are considering getting children their first tablet or mobile device?
Oh, I'd really ask them to think twice. I know that your young child may be very obedient and maybe listen to your rules, and you may have certain rules you're planning to implement. But we have to remember that our children at 9 or 10 will not be the same when they're adolescent. So whatever we allow now, we have to be prepared that they're going to push and push and push for more and more access online. So my biggest advice is just to delay. Let children be children. Let's preserve their innocence. I know that some people would say, well, you're educating your son with all this information, so how is that preserving his innocence? But in fact, what I learned through my daughter was that you don't want an experience like what I had to happen to your child. So it's better to be, I guess, educated, educate your children, and then put boundaries in place to ensure that they are safe.
Yeah.
So my advice would be no tech gifts for Christmas. In our home, we have a blanket policy. There's just no tech gifts ever. I mean, if my older children got a device when they were 15 or 16, it was on loan. It was my device.
Yeah. And in view of that, and I'm sure you've asked yourself this many times now, how, if you look back at the horrific situation that your daughter went through, how would you have faced it now with the knowledge and the experience that you have now? Are there changes that you wouldn't have had let her have a screen?
Well, she didn't. She had access only to the iMac in our house. So this happened not in my home, which I only found out a couple of years later. In fact, only once I'd written the story was she able to tell me where it had taken place. But I would have had far more conversations with her about internet safety and about protective behavior. I didn't actually even have those conversations when she was little. And I guess I would remind her continuously that she could come to me with anything, that nothing would shock me.
Yeah.
And that's the regret I have to live with. But I'm trying to make change with my son.
Well, I think it's an innocent naivety, because it's no different to when I joined the police force, I wasn't aware of what crimes and horrific things were happening around me, because I didn't need to know. I wasn't my life wasn't impacted by these horrible things.
Yeah.
And it's once you sort of have exposure to it, of course you become wiser for it.
Yeah.
But we both probably sit here and hope that nobody else experiences it. But unfortunately, this is being experienced on a daily basis worldwide.
And that's precisely why I called the story a regular story that rarely gets told, because I believe this is happening to children all over the world. And there's some children. My daughter came to me only 2 weeks ago and said to me, do you know why I couldn't sleep at night? Because she said, that man said he would find me, and I was afraid I'd be murdered in my sleep. That memory only surfaced 2 weeks ago. And this is what trauma does to children. And that was very hard for me to hear, because it gave me an indication of how afraid she'd been for 2 years before she'd found the courage to disclose to me. And I wonder how many children are going to sleep or trying to go to sleep every night with that same fear.
And we spoke about this before we came on air, and we spoke about industry news and what's grabbed our attention in relation to this space. And I instantly brought up Meta, Facebook, with their plans to fully encrypt their sort of messaging platform. What if you could be in a room with these tech people, Jen? What would you say to them?
Oh dear!
Apart from strangling them.
No, that's tough. I would say that they have a moral obligation to keep their users safe. And they're walking away from that moral obligation. If you consider the number of reports that Meta made alone to NCMEC last year, they're just going to go up in smoke. And I cannot actually believe that this is. I know it has to be allowed, but I don't know how it is able to be allowed. It makes me incredibly angry and incredibly sad, because it means that we're going backwards.
Yeah, and we have this amazing technology that can detect and find these things. And I've spoken about it before on this podcast about even Apple when they announced, and I was amazed that they announced it and thought it was fantastic when they announced that they were going to start scanning people's iCloud accounts for child abuse material. And they have the technology to do it.
Yeah.
We know they do it because they classify our photos of dogs, cats,
Yeah,
etc.
exactly.
So we're happy for it to be done. But when Apple announced that, they were shot down publicly and quickly retreated on that decision.
I think that people think too much of, I think they feel as though there'll be a spotlight on them.
Yeah.
No one is interested in their daily activities and their random photos of their animals and their holiday destinations. This is about saving children.
Yeah.
And I can't think of anything that's more important.
And these big tech companies, they already have all your information.
Exactly.
It's how they make money.
That's right.
And people often wonder, I was chatting with a friend about a shed, and the next time I went on Facebook, I had adverts for sheds.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing that irks me the most, is that the fact is that you've got a phone, they got your data, so just deal with it, right?
Exactly. and like you say, that they're not really interested in our daily lives. Yes, they're getting our metrics for what shops we walk past and things like that, but that's marketing.
That's right.
But this is child safety, and they could easily detect it and help prevent it, and they're not.
No, absolutely. I mean, I have my own word for Mark Zuckerberg, but I won't say it publicly. But it's not pleasant.
So you've obviously taken a great involvement and seen sort of, I know you're heavily involved in Australia, but you've also done courses that are based in the UK from like our COP.
Yeah.
So globally, you've got sort of an eye on this industry. Who do you think are leading in child protection, and what do you think about their approaches should be replicated?
Whoa, that's a big one. I very much admire the work of the Internet Watch Foundation, the Child Rescue Coalition, Thorn. I mean, I would love to work for the Internet Watch Foundation, but I'm in Australia. But I think that they're the three that come to mind in terms of. I mean, I'm sure there are many others. There are a lot of organizations who are working exceptionally hard to try to bring this crime type some awareness. But unfortunately, I think what we're dealing with is parent apathy. It is easier to give your child a device to keep them quiet, to not make a mess, than it is to actually face the issues that their children may face online and probably will face online. I always say it's not a matter of if, it's when your child will be contacted, because they will.
Yeah. And and what do you think has been the biggest advancements that have been made in combating child sex exploitation? Do you think there's anything holding it back? And we've just discussed a clear one, which is encryption.
I'm afraid I don't have a lot of optimism.
Yeah.
Especially now with the move to encryption by one of the biggest social media companies in the world, or the biggest. And I find it, when I see the NCMEC figures rise every year, I feel desperately concerned. I'd have to say I'm afraid I don't feel optimistic. I think that it boils down once again to the primary carers.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
I mean, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. I think I've heard that term said over and over again. And there are way too many of them out there. And so I think it does come back down to the home, and to have very, very, very loving and trusting and open relationships with your children, and protect them.
And you're right, because we don't want this to be a reactive space. No. We want it to be a preventative space. And I don't know if you remember the advert, and it was extremely well done. I think it was published by New Zealand.
Yes.
About that and I tip my hat to them because it was extremely. There must have been a few pushbacks about releasing that as an advert, but it was extreme. It was received extremely well.
Yeah, exactly.
And for those of people who aren't aware of that advert, it was, if I remember correctly, it was basically a typical couple who would be involved in a pornography movie, turning up at a house, and a mum had opened the door for her young son because they were there to go and see him.
Yeah.
Because they'd been chatting online or something along those lines. Right. But it was sort of, the mum had no awareness. The son was suddenly extremely embarrassed. But it was just it was an eye-opening advert.
It was effective. Yeah, and I don't think that the documentary is available overseas yet, but The Children in the Pictures is a must-watch for any parent. In fact, I think you may be able to find it on YouTube, but I really would encourage every parent to watch that because it really illustrates how vast the problem is.
Yeah. And if I was to give you an open checkbook to solve this issue, how would you use that?
Oh my goodness. I think it comes down to education. We can't, as you said, we can't have a reactive approach to this. We have to have a preventative approach. So we would have to be putting a huge amount of investment into education. And children, yes, but parents.
Yeah.
I mean, my son is probably the only child in his class who's supervised online. And I know this because most of the children talk about gaming.
And how many is that class? What is the class size?
25.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming.
It is. And it's going to get worse as he gets older. And I've warned him. I've said, you're going to feel left out a whole lot more as the years go by.
Yeah, because that plays into it as well, isn't it? Peer pressure, that when they can see their friends are getting a new device and things like.
Yes. And I mean, we had a talk at my son's school by an online safety presenter here in Australia, and he did a survey with the children. So these are children between years 3 and 6, so it's about 8 and 11. And 70% of those children said they were allowed their internet connected device in their bedroom at night. And the number that were on social media and the number gaming, he said, this is a gaming school.
Yeah.
So we have to educate parents. And the problem is when you give a talk, it's the parents who kind of have some idea of the problem that come.
Yeah.
Most of the time you don't catch the parents who really need to be there.
And you're 100% right with the education, that this really needs to, because I said earlier, my son's 6, and my wife and I have just received the letter from the school to indicate that they're now going to start talking about sex education. And rightly so, that it has to be part of a child's development.
Yeah.
But so does online safety.
Absolutely.
It also needs introducing at the same time.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think that, if we do it as parents, then our children know that there's no topic that is kind of taboo. If we can talk with them openly and say, look, these are the things that happen. If anything does ever happen, you can always come to us. Children do feel embarrassed and they do feel shame. I mean, my daughter lived with her shame for years. I think it's only in the last couple of years that she's been able to actually shed the shame she felt.
Yeah.
But if we can have, if our children are more likely to come to us if we're having these conversations with them.
And I think for parents and carers, the awareness, did you see the recent survey that was done in Australia of how many people were sexually attracted to minors?
I did.
Yeah. That was pretty alarming.
That was. Yeah. That was very challenging to read.
Yeah. And I'll post a link to it in the show notes because it's quite horrific and a real eye-opener for people to make them aware of how big this issue is.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially the number of men who said that they would do something with a child if they knew they would never be caught.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we really do have to ramp up the education. And I'm just one person, and I'm doing what I can, but it's a real challenge to reach parents.
Yeah. And I'm aware that it's your evening, and I appreciate you giving up your time, Jen. So I'm going to ask my final question, and that is provided by our previous guest, who was Jim Metcalf, who's a trainer for a forensic company called X-Ways. And he has asked, and this is $1 million question, is how do you handle telling a parent to be a parent and not rely on technology?
Look, I'm going to have to take a tip from John Rouse, and what he says is, you've got to be their parent and not their friend. And I love that, because basically, we have to put boundaries in for children. So when a parent comes to me, and some do, and they say, I've stuffed up. My child has their device, and I don't think I can take it away from them.
Yeah.
What I have to say to them is, who's paying for the device? And you are entitled as a parent to change your mind. You are entitled to go back and say to your child and explain to them why. There's no point in just saying you're not having that anymore. You need to sit down and explain to them why. But it is really important that we remember our role as parents. Too many parents these days want to be their children's friend. We're very time poor, so I can understand on one hand why we'd rather not rock the boat. But when it comes to child safety, we have to rock the boat. And you don't want we have children in our practice who are 17 who are having AVOs taken out against them by the police because they've attacked their parents because they're addicted to gaming. So you don't want to get to that point. So I think the sooner you begin to put in the boundaries, the better.
And the quote from John, do you want to give people a little background of John's history?
Yes. So, John Russ was the former detective in charge of Task Force Argos. He's also features in the movie, in the documentary, The Children in the Pictures. And he's done, well, I guess I'd have to say he's done extraordinary work in saving children. The victim identification specialists have my utmost admiration. It's grueling work, but they are saving children, and that's what we have to do. We have to.
Yeah, John's been in this space for a long time, but I just wanted there probably won't be many who aren't aware of John's work, but he's obviously, like you say, he's retired from the police now, but he's still continuing in his mission of keeping children safe.
Yes. I think it's a passion that does. I can't imagine doing anything else. Let's just say that. I think once you really understand the gravity of the situation, it's very hard to walk away.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And Jen, a huge thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that the listeners are all going to resonate with the reason for your journey. And I'm sure our discussions here today will have given education and given people many considerations in regards to child safety online. And I will make sure I post a link to Jen's LinkedIn profile so you can connect with her, and your website so our listeners can connect and see some of the great work that you're achieving in this industry. But Jen, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.